Introduction. It was after midnight and many of the guests had already gone to bed, leaving behind their amber-tailed tumblers of high-end whiskey. The poker dealer who had been hired for the occasion from a local casino had left a half-hour earlier, but the remaining players had convinced her to leave the table and cards so that they could keep playing. The group still hovering over the felt and chips was dwarfed by the vaulted, wood-timbered ceiling, 3 stories up. The large wall of windows on the far side of the table looked out onto a long dock, bobbing on the shimmering surface of Lake Tahoe. Sitting at one end of the table, with his back to the lake, 29-year-old Eric Voorhees didn't look like someone who 3 years earlier had been unemployed, mired in credit card debt, and doing odd jobs to pay for an apartment in New Hampshire. Tonight Eric fitted right in with his suede Oxfords and tailored jeans, and he bantered easily with the hedge fund manager sitting next to him. His hairline was already receding, but he still had a distinct, fresh-faced youthfulness to him. Showing his boyish dimples, Eric joked about his poor performance at their poker game the night before, and called it a part of his long game. "I was setting myself up for tonight," he said with a broad toothy smile, before pushing a pile of chips into the middle of the table. Eric could afford to sustain the losses. He'd recently sold a gambling website that was powered by the enigmatic digital money and payment network known as Bitcoin. He'd purchased the gambling site back in 2012 for about $225, rebranded it as Satoshi Dice, and sold it a year later for some $11 million. He was also sitting on a stash of bitcoins that he'd begun acquiring a few years earlier when each bitcoin was valued at just a few dollars. A bitcoin was now worth around $500, sending his holdings into the millions. Initially snubbed by investors and serious business folk, Eric was now attracting a lot of high-powered interest. He had been invited to Lake Tahoe by the hedge fund manager sitting next to him at the poker table, Dan Moorhead, who had wanted to pick the brains of those who had already struck it rich in the Bitcoin gold rush. For Voorhees, like many of the other men at Moorhead's house, the impulse that had propelled him into this gold rush had both everything and nothing to do with getting rich. Soon after he first learned about the technology from a Facebook post, Eric predicted that the value of every Bitcoin would grow astronomically. But this growth, he had long believed, would be a consequence of the multi-layered Bitcoin computer code remaking many of the prevailing power structures of the world, including Wall Street banks and national governments, doing to money what the internet had done to the postal service and the media industry. As Eric saw it, Bitcoin's growth wouldn't just make him wealthy. It would also lead to a more just and peaceful world in which governments wouldn't be able to pay for wars and individuals would have control over their own money and their own destiny. It was not surprising that Eric, with ambitions like these, had a turbulent journey since his days of unemployment in New Hampshire. After moving to New York, he had helped convince the Winklevoss twins, Tyler and Cameron, of Facebook fame, to put almost $1 million into a startup he helped create, called BitInstant. But that relationship ended with a knockdown, drag-out fight, after which Eric resigned from the company and moved to Panama with his girlfriend. More recently, Eric had been spending many of his days in his office in Panama, dealing with investigators from the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, one of the top financial regulatory agencies, who were questioning a deal in which he'd sold stock in one of his startups for bitcoins. The stock had ended up providing his investors with big returns. And the regulators, by Eric's assessment, didn't seem to even understand the technology. But they were right that he had not registered his shares with regulators. The investigation, in any case, was better than the situation facing one of Eric's former partners from BitInstant, who had been arrested 2 months earlier, in January 2014, on charges related to money laundering. Eric, by now, was not easily rattled. It helped that, unlike many passionate partisans, he had a sense of humor about himself and the quixotic movement he had found himself at the middle of. "I try to remind myself that Bitcoin will probably collapse," he said. "As bullish as I am on it, I try to check myself and remind myself that new innovative things usually fail. Just as a sanity check." But he kept going, and not just because of the money that had piled up in his bank account. It was also because of the new money that he and the other men in Lake Tahoe were helping to bring into existence, a new kind of money that he believed would change the world. The Bitcoin concept first came onto the scene in more modest circumstances, 5 years earlier, when it was posted to an obscure mailing list by a shadowy author going by the name Satoshi Nakamoto. From the beginning, Satoshi envisioned a digital analog to old-fashioned gold, a new kind of universal money that could be owned by everyone and spent anywhere. Like gold, these new digital coins were worth only what someone was willing to pay for them, initially nothing. But the system was set up so that, like gold, Bitcoins would always be scarce, only 21 million of them would ever be released, and hard to counterfeit. As with gold, it required work to release new ones from their source, computational work in the case of Bitcoins. Bitcoin also held certain obvious advantages over gold as a new place to store value. It didn't take a ship to move Bitcoins from London to New York, it took just a private digital key and the click of a mouse. For security, Satoshi relied on uncrackable mathematical formulas rather than armed guards. But the comparison to gold went only so far in explaining why Bitcoin ended up attracting such attention. Each ingot of gold has always existed independent of every other ingot. Bitcoins, on the other hand, were designed to live within a cleverly constructed, decentralized network, just as all the websites in the world exist only within the decentralized network known as the Internet. Like the Internet, the Bitcoin network wasn't run by some central authority. Instead, it was built and sustained by all the people who hooked their computers into it, which anyone in the world could do. With the Internet, what connected everyone together was a set of software rules, known as the Internet Protocol, which governed how information moved around. Bitcoin had its own software protocol, the rules that dictated how the system worked. The technical details of how all this worked could be mind-numbingly complicated, involving advanced math and cryptography. But from its earliest days, a small group of dedicated followers saw that at its base, Bitcoin was, very simply, a new way of creating, holding, and sending money. Bitcoins were not like dollars and euros, which are created by central banks and held and transferred by big, powerful financial institutions. This was a currency created and sustained by its users, with new money slowly distributed to the people who helped support the network. Given that it aimed to challenge some of the most powerful institutions in our society, the Bitcoin network was, from early on, described by its followers in utopian terms. Just as the internet took power from big media organizations and put it in the hands of bloggers and dissidents, Bitcoin held out the promise of taking power from banks and governments and giving it to the people using the money. This was all rather high-minded stuff, and it attracted plenty of derision. Most ordinary folks imagined it falling somewhere on the spectrum between Tamagotchi pet and Ponzi scheme when they heard about it at all. But Bitcoin had the good fortune of entering the world at a utopian moment, in the wake of a financial crisis that had exposed many of the shortcomings of our existing financial and political system, creating a desire for alternatives. The Tea Party, Occupy Wall Street, and WikiLeaks, among others, had divergent goals, but they were united in their desire to take power back from the privileged elite and give it to individuals. Bitcoin provided an apparent technological solution to these desires. The degree to which Bitcoin spoke to its followers was apparent from the variety of people who left their old lives behind to chase the promise of this technology, aficionados like Eric Voorhees and many of his new friends. It didn't hurt that if Bitcoin worked, it would make the early users fabulously wealthy. As Eric liked to say, it's the first thing I know where you can both get rich and change the world. Given the opportunity to make money, Bitcoin was not only attracting disaffected revolutionaries. Eric's host, Dan Morehead, had gone to Princeton and worked at Goldman Sachs before starting his own hedge fund. Morehead was a leading figure among the moneyed interests who had recently been pumping tens of millions of dollars into the Bitcoin ecosystem, hoping for big returns. In Silicon Valley, investors and entrepreneurs were clamoring to find ways to use Bitcoin to improve on existing payment systems like PayPal, Visa, and Western Union and to steal Wall Street's business. Even people who had little sympathy for Occupy Wall Street or the Tea Party could understand the benefits of a more universal money that doesn't have to be exchanged at every border, the advantages of a digital payment method that doesn't require you to hand over your identifying information each time you use it, the fairness of a currency that even the poorest people in the world can keep in a digital account without paying hefty fees, rather than relying only on cash, and the convenience of a payment system that makes it possible for online services to charge a penny or a dime, to view a single news article or skip an ad, skirting the current limits imposed by the 20 or 30-cent minimum charge for a credit card transaction. In the end, though, many of the people interested in more practical applications of Bitcoin still ended up talking about the technology in revolutionary terms, as an opportunity to make money by disrupting the existing status quo. At the dinner a few hours before the late-night poker game, Morehead had joked about the fact that, at the time, all the Bitcoins in the world were worth about the same amount as the company Urban Outfitters, the purveyor of ripped jeans and dorm room decorations, around $5 billion. That's just pretty wild, right? Morehead said. I think when they dig up our society, all Planet of Apes style, in a couple of centuries, Bitcoin is probably going to have had a greater impact on the world than Urban Outfitters. We're still in early days. Many bankers, economists, and government officials dismissed the Bitcoin fanatics as naive promoters of a speculative frenzy not unlike the Dutch tulip mania 4 centuries earlier. On several occasions, the Bitcoin story bore out the warnings of the critics, illustrating the dangers involved in moving toward a more digitized world with no central authority. Just a few weeks before Morehead's gathering, the largest Bitcoin company in the world, the exchange known as Mt. Gox, announced that it had lost the equivalent of about $400 million worth of its users' Bitcoins and was going out of business, the latest of many such scandals to hit Bitcoin users. But none of the crises managed to destroy the enthusiasm of the Bitcoin believers, and the number of users kept growing through thick and thin. At the time of Morehead's gathering, more than 5 million Bitcoin wallets had been opened up on various websites, most of them outside the United States. The people at Morehead's house represented the wide variety of characters who had been drawn in. They included a former Walmart executive who had flown in from China, a recent college graduate from Slovenia, a banker from London, and 2 old fraternity brothers from Georgia Tech. Some were motivated by their skepticism toward the government, others by their hatred of the big banks, and yet others by more intimate, personal experiences. The Chinese Walmart executive, for instance, had grown up with grandparents who escaped the communist revolution with only the wealth they had stored in gold. Bitcoin seemed to him like a much more easily transportable alternative in an uncertain world. It was these people, in different places with different motivations, who had built Bitcoin and were continuing to do so, and who are the subject of this story. The creator of Bitcoin, Satoshi, disappeared back in 2011, leaving behind open-source software that the users of Bitcoin could update and improve. 5 years later, it was estimated that only 15% of the basic Bitcoin computer code was the same as what Satoshi had written. Beyond the work on the software, Bitcoin, like all money, was always only as useful and powerful as the number of people using it. Each new person who joined in made it that much more likely to survive. This, then, is not a normal startup story, about a lone genius molding the world in his image and making gobs of money. It is, instead, a tale of a group invention that tapped into many of the prevailing currents of our time, the anger at the government and Wall Street, the battles between Silicon Valley and the financial industry, and the hopes we have placed in technology to save us from our own human frailty, as well as the fear that the power of technology can generate. Each of the people discussed in this book had his or her own reason for chasing this new idea, but all their lives have been shaped by the ambitions, greed, idealism, and human frailty that have elevated Bitcoin from an obscure academic paper to a billion-dollar industry. For some participants, the outcome has been the type of wealth on display at Moorhead's house, where the stone entranceway is decorated with Moorhead's personal heraldic crest. For others, it has ended in poverty and even prison. Bitcoin itself is always one big hack away from total failure. But even if it does collapse, it has already provided one of the most fascinating tests of how money works, who benefits from it, and how it might be improved. It is unlikely to replace the dollar in 5 years, but it provides a glimpse of where we might be when the government inevitably stops printing the faces of dead presidents on expensive paper. The morning after the big poker game, as the guests were packing up to go, Voorhees sat at the end of the pier behind Moorhead's house, which was sitting high above the water after a winter with little snowfall. The joy he had shown at the poker table the night before was gone. He had a look of chagrin on his face as he talked about his recent decision to resign as the CEO of the Bitcoin startup he had been running in Panama. His position with the company had prevented him from speaking about the revolutionary potential of Bitcoin, for fear that it could hurt his company. "My passion is not running a business, it is building the Bitcoin world," he explained. On top of that, his girlfriend had grown tired of living in Panama and Eric was missing his family back in the United States. In a few weeks he was planning to move back to Colorado, where he grew up. Because of Bitcoin, though, he would be going home a very different person from what he was when he left. It was a situation that many of his fellow Bitcoiners could sympathize with. Part 1. Chapter 1. January 10, 2009. It was a Saturday. It was his son's birthday. The Santa Barbara weather was beautiful. And his sister-in-law was in from France. But Hal Finney needed to be at his computer. This was a day he had been anticipating for months and, in some sense, for decades. Hal didn't even try to explain to his wife, Fran, what was occupying him. She was a physical therapist and rarely understood his computer work. But with this one, where would he even begin? "Honey, I'm going to try to make a new kind of money." That, in essence, was his intention when, after a long morning run, he sat down in his modest home office, a corner of his living room with an old sectional desk, taken up primarily by 4 computer screens of different shape and make, all wired to the separate computers he used for work and personal pursuits. Any space that wasn't occupied by computer equipment was covered in a jumble of papers, exercise books, and old programming manuals. It wasn't much to look at. But sitting there, Hal could see his patio on the other side of his living room, bathed in California sun, even in the middle of January. On the carpet to his left lay Archie, his faithful Rhodesian ridgeback, named after a star in the constellation Boötes. This was where he felt at home, and where he had done much of his most creative work as a programmer. He fired up his hulking IBM ThinkCenter, settled in, and clicked on the website he'd gotten in an email the previous day while he was at work, www.bitcoin.org. Bitcoin had first crossed his screen a few months earlier, in a message sent to one of the many mailing lists he subscribed to. The back and forth was usually between the familiar personalities he'd been talking to for years who inhabited the relatively specialized corner of coding where he worked. But this particular email came from an unfamiliar name, Satoshi Nakamoto, and it described what was referred to as an eCash with the catchy name Bitcoin. Digital money was something Hal had experimented with for a long time, enough to make him skeptical about whether it could ever work. But something jumped out in this email. Satoshi promised a kind of cash that wouldn't need a bank or any other third party to manage it. It was a system that could live entirely in the collective computing memory of the people who used it. Hal was particularly drawn to Satoshi's claim that users could own and trade bitcoins without providing identifying information to any central authorities. Hal had spent most of his professional life working on programs that allowed people to elude the ever-watchful gaze of the government. After reading the 9-page description, contained in what looked like an academic paper, Hal responded enthusiastically. "When Wikipedia started, I never thought it would work, but it has proven to be a great success for some of the same reasons," he wrote to the group. In the face of skepticism from others on the email list, Hal had urged Satoshi to write up some actual code for the system he had described. A few months later, on this Saturday in January, Hal downloaded Satoshi's code from the Bitcoin website. A simple .exe file installed the Bitcoin program and automatically opened up a crisp-looking window on his computer desktop. When the program opened for the first time, it automatically generated a list of Bitcoin addresses that would be Hal's account numbers in the system and the password, or private key, that gave him access to each address. Beyond that, the program had only a few functions. The main one, send coins, didn't seem like much of an option for Hal given that he didn't have any coins to send. But before he could poke around further, the program crashed. It didn't deter Hal. After looking at his computer logs, he wrote to Satoshi to explain what had happened when his computer had tried to link up with other computers on the network. Apart from Hal, the log showed that there were only 2 other computers on the network and both of those were from a single IP address, presumably Satoshi's, tied to an internet provider in California. Within an hour, Satoshi had written back, expressing disappointment with the failure. He said he'd been testing it heavily and never encountered any trouble. But he told Hal that he had trimmed down the program to make it easier to download, which must have introduced the problem. "I guess I made the wrong decision," Satoshi wrote with palpable frustration. Satoshi sent Hal a new version of the program, with some of the old material restored, and thanked Hal for his help. When it, too, crashed, Hal kept at it. He finally got it running using a program that operated outside Microsoft Windows. Once it was up, he clicked on the most exciting-sounding function in the drop-down menu, Generate Coins. When he did this, the processor in his computer audibly clicked into gear at a high clip. With everything running, Hal could take a break and attend to his familial duties, including a family dinner at a nearby Chinese restaurant and a small birthday party for his son. The instructions Satoshi had included with the software said that actually generating coins could take days or months, depending on the speed of your computer and the competition on the network. Hal dashed off a quick note telling Satoshi that everything was working. "I have to go out, but I'll leave this version running for a while." Hal had already read enough to understand the basic work his computer was doing. Once the Bitcoin program was running, it logged into a designated chat channel to find other computers running the software, basically just Satoshi's computers at this point. All the computers were trying to capture new Bitcoins, which were released into the system in bundles of 50 coins. Each new block of Bitcoin was assigned to the address of one user who linked into the network and won a race of sorts to solve a computational puzzle. When a computer won one round of the race and captured new coins, all the other machines on the network updated their shared record of the number of Bitcoins owned by that computer's Bitcoin address. Then the computers on the network would automatically begin racing to solve a new problem to unlock the next batch of 50 coins. When Hal returned to his computer in the evening, he immediately saw that it had made him 50 Bitcoins, now recorded next to one of his Bitcoin addresses and also recorded on the public ledger that kept track of all Bitcoins. These, the 78th block of coins generated, were among the first 4,000 Bitcoins to make it into the real world. At the time they were worth exactly nothing, but that didn't dampen Hal's enthusiasm. In a congratulatory email to Satoshi that he sent to the entire mailing list, he allowed himself a flight of fancy. "Imagine that Bitcoin is successful and becomes the dominant payment system in use throughout the world," he wrote. "Then the total value of the currency should be equal to the total value of all the wealth in the world." By his own calculations, that would make each Bitcoin worth some $10 million. Even if the odds of Bitcoin succeeding to this degree are slim, are they really 100 million to 1 against? Something to think about, he wrote before signing off. Hal Finney had long been preoccupied by how, in look and texture, the future would be different from the present. One of 4 children of an itinerant petroleum engineer, Hal had worked his way through the classics of science fiction, but he also read calculus books for fun and eventually attended the California Institute of Technology. He never backed down from an intellectual challenge. During his freshman year, he took a course on gravitational field theory that was designed for graduate students. But he wasn't a typical nerd. A big, athletic guy who loved to ski in the California mountains, he had none of the social awkwardness common among Caltech students. This active spirit carried over into his intellectual pursuits. When he read the novels of Larry Niven, which discussed the possibility of cryogenically freezing humans and later bringing them back to life, Hal didn't just ponder the potential in his dorm room. He located a foundation dedicated to making this process a reality and signed up to receive the Alcor Life Extension Foundation's magazine. Eventually, he would pay to have his and his family's bodies put into Alcor's frozen vaults near Los Angeles. The advent of the internet had been a boon for Hal, allowing him to connect with other people in far-flung places who were thinking about similarly obscure but radical ideas. Even before the invention of the first web browser, Hal joined some of the earliest online communities, with names like the Cypherpunks and Extropians, where he jumped into debates about how new technology could be harnessed to shape the future they all were dreaming up. Few questions obsessed these groups more than the matter of how technology would alter the balance of power between corporations and governments on one hand and individuals on the other. Technology clearly gave individuals unprecedented new powers. The nascent internet allowed these people to communicate with kindred spirits and spread their ideas in ways that had previously been impossible. But there was constant discussion of how the creeping digitization of life also gave governments and companies more command over perhaps the most valuable and dangerous commodity in the information age: information. In the days before computers, governments certainly kept records about their citizens, but most people lived in ways that made it impossible to glean much information about them. In the 1990s, though, long before the National Security Agency was discovered to be snooping on the cell phones of ordinary citizens and Facebook's privacy policies became a matter for national debate, the cypherpunks saw that the digitization of life made it much easier for the authorities to harvest data about citizens, making the data vulnerable to capture by nefarious actors. The cypherpunks became consumed by the question of how people could protect their personal information and maintain their privacy. The Cypherpunk Manifesto, delivered to the mailing list in 1993 by the Berkeley mathematician Eric Hughes, began, "Privacy is necessary for an open society in the electronic age." This line of thinking was, in part, an outgrowth of the libertarian politics that had become popular in California in the 1970s and 1980s. Suspicion regarding government had a natural appeal for programmers like Hal, who were at work creating a new world through code, without needing to rely on anyone else. Hal had imbibed these ideas at Caltech and in his reading of the novels of Ayn Rand. But the issue of privacy in the internet age had an appeal beyond libertarian circles, among human rights activists and other protest movements. None of the cypherpunks saw a solution to the problem in running away from technology. Instead, Hal and the others aimed to find answers in technology and particularly in the science of encrypting information. Encryption technologies had historically been a privilege largely reserved for only the most powerful institutions. Private individuals could try to encode their communications, but governments and armed forces almost always had the power to crack such codes. In the 1970s and 1980s, though, mathematicians at Stanford and MIT made a series of breakthroughs that made it possible, for the first time, for ordinary people to encrypt, or scramble, messages in a way that could be decrypted only by the intended recipient and not cracked even by the most powerful supercomputers. Every user of the new technology, known as public key cryptography, would receive a public key, a unique jumble of letters and numbers that serves as a sort of address that could be distributed freely, and a corresponding private key, which is supposed to be known only by the user. The two keys are related, mathematically, in a way that ensures that only the user, let's call her Alice, as cryptographers often did, with her private key, can unlock messages sent to her public key, and only she can sign off on messages associated with her public key. The unique relationship between each public and private key was determined by complicated math equations that were constructed so cleverly that no one with a particular public key would ever be able to work backward to figure out the corresponding private key, not even the most powerful supercomputer. This whole setup would later play a central role in the Bitcoin software. HAL was introduced to the potential of public key cryptography in 1991 by the path-breaking cryptographer David Chaum, who had been experimenting with ways to use public key cryptography to protect individual privacy. It seemed so obvious to me, HAL told the other cypherpunks of his first encounter with Chaum's writing. Here we are faced with the problems of loss of privacy, creeping computerization, massive databases, more centralization, and Chaum offers a completely different direction to go in, one which puts power into the hands of individuals rather than governments and corporations. As usual, when HAL found something exciting, he didn't just passively read up on it. On nights and weekends, after his job as a software developer, he began helping with a volunteer project, referred to as Pretty Good Privacy, or PGP, which allowed people to send each other messages that could be encrypted using public key cryptography. The founder of the project, Phil Zimmermann, was an anti-nuclear activist who wanted to give dissidents a way to communicate outside the purview of governments. Before long, Zimmermann brought HAL on as the first employee at PGP. Idealistic projects like PGP generally had a small audience. But the potential import of the technology became apparent when federal prosecutors launched a criminal investigation into PGP and Zimmermann. The government categorized encryption technology, such as PGP, as weapon-grade munitions, and this designation made it illegal to export. While the case was eventually dropped, HAL had to lie low with his own involvement in PGP for years and could never take credit for some of his important contributions to the project. The extropians and cypherpunks were working on several different experiments that could help empower individuals against traditional sources of authority. But money was, from the beginning, at the center of their efforts to reimagine the future. Money is to any market economy what water, fire, or blood is to the human ecosystem, a basic substance needed for everything else to work. For programmers, existing currencies, which were valid only within particular national borders and subject to technologically incompetent banks, seemed unnecessarily constrained. The science fiction that HAL and others had grown up on almost always featured some kind of universal money that could span galaxies. In Star Wars it was the Galactic Credit Standard, in the Knight's Dawn trilogy it was Jovian Credit. Beyond these more fanciful ambitions, the existing financial system was viewed by the cypherpunks as one of the biggest threats to individual privacy. Few types of information reveal as much about a person like Alice, the cryptographer's favorite, as her financial transactions. If snoopers get access to her credit card statements, they can follow her movements over the course of a day. It's no accident that financial records are one of the primary ways that fugitives are tracked down. Eric Hughes's Cypherpunk Manifesto had dwelled on this problem at great length. When my identity is revealed by the underlying mechanism of the transaction, I have no privacy. I cannot here selectively reveal myself, I must always reveal myself, Hughes wrote. Privacy in an open society requires anonymous transaction systems, he added. Cold, hard cash had long provided an anonymous way of making payments, but this cash did not make the transition over to the digital realm. As soon as money became digital, some third party, such as a bank, was always involved and therefore able to trace the transaction. What HAL, Chaum, and the cypherpunks wanted was a cash for the digital age that could be secure and uncounterfeitable without sacrificing the privacy of its users. The same year as Hughes's manifesto, HAL wrote an email to the group imagining a kind of digital cash for which no records are kept of where I spend my money. All the bank knows is how much I have withdrawn each month. A month later, HAL even came up with a cheeky moniker for it. I thought of a new name today for digital cash, Crash, taken from crypto cash. Chaum himself had already come up with his own version of this by the time the cypherpunks got interested. Working out of an institute in Amsterdam, he had created DigiCash, an online money that could be spent anywhere in the world without requiring users to hand over any personal information. The system harnessed public key cryptography to allow for what Chaum called blind digital signatures, which allowed people to sign off on transactions without providing any identifying information. When Mark Twain Bank in the United States began experimenting with DigiCash, HAL signed up for an account. But Chaum's effort would rub HAL and others the wrong way. With DigiCash, a central organization, namely Chaum's company, needed to confirm every digital signature. This meant that a certain degree of trust needed to be placed in that central organization not to tinker with balances or go out of business. Indeed, when Chaum's company went bankrupt in 1998, DigiCash went down with it. These concerns pushed HAL and others to work toward a digital cash that wouldn't rely on any central institution. The problem, of course, was that someone needed to check that people weren't simply copying and pasting their digital money and spending it twice. Some of the cypherpunks simply gave up on the project, but HAL wasn't one to fold so easily. Ironically, for a person so eager to create new money, HAL's interest wasn't primarily financial. The programs he was writing, like PGP, were explicitly designed to be available to anyone, free. His political distrust of government, meanwhile, was not driven by selfish resentment about paying taxes. During the 1990s, HAL would calculate the maximum bill for his tax bracket and send in a check for that amount, so as to avoid the hassle of actually filling out a return. He bought his modest home on the outskirts of Santa Barbara and stuck with it over the years. He didn't seem to mind that he had to work out of his living room or that the blue recliners in front of his desk were wearing thin. Instead of being motivated by self-interest, his work seemed driven by an intellectual curiosity that bubbled over in each email he wrote, and by his sense of what he thought other people deserved. The work we are doing here, broadly speaking, is dedicated to this goal of making Big Brother obsolete. It's important work, Hal would write to his fellow travelers. If things work out well, we may be able to look back and see that it was the most important work we have ever done.